So let's look briefly at perestroika in Central Asia, and we'll look at this more in the next set of lectures. Um, we'll start with 1981 to 1985, sort of the pre-perestroika period. And the big thing marking this period in Central Asia was the cotton affair. Remember, under Andropov, you had a huge anti-corruption campaign, and also remember that Gorbachev was involved in this because he was sort of Andropov's right-hand man, or very close to Andropov at least. And the Uzbek Party, Communist Party especially, was embroiled in this cotton affair because they had lots of higher-ups who were involved, but also lots of people lower down. So again, remember the cotton market was the key to the economy of Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, but also significantly in Kyrgyzstan, in the Fergana Valley, and many parts of Turkmenistan as well. Moscow was the only purchaser of cotton, so it determined the prices, and prices were always set artificially low, just as they had been under the Tsarist period. Okay, in this way, Moscow was really squeezing Central Asia. So instead of handing over 200 tons of cotton, Uzbek elites cooked the books, and they said they were handing over 200 tons of cotton, when in fact they were only handing over 150 tons of cotton. Importantly, this wasn't because they weren't producing that last 50 tons of cotton, the difference between the 200 and the 150 they were actually handing over. It was because they were keeping it for themselves and they were selling it privately. So because you've got a huge network involved in getting cotton from the field to the center, in other words, back to Russia, you've got a production network, you've got a storage network, you've got a transportation network, a huge, huge network that's involved. Lots of people had their hands in the process, and lots of people got their hands dirty in this particular scandal. At each lower level was bribing the next higher level in order to go along with this. And when occasionally people were caught, they blamed spoilage and theft. They said, oh, well, the cotton was gotten mildewy or moldy or whatever. I don't know what happens to cotton. I honestly don't. But things happen. It gets spoiled. So some elites were growing incredibly rich on this, and especially regional leaders. One of whom actually constructed his own little empire. He had this elaborately decorated palace. It was equipped with a harem, his own jail, his own guards, stables, everything you needed to be happy. So all this was happening in Central Asia. And the crackdown was in Uzbekistan seen as Moscow being anti-Uzbek. And nationalists would later bring this grievance up when full-on perestroika comes out. But so there was a crackdown, and people were arrested, and people were kicked out of their party positions. And this goes further when Gorbachev comes to power. Because remember, Chernenko comes to power after Andropov and reverses course on a lot of this, and so there's less pressure. But then Gorbachev comes to power in 1985. So the first phase of perestroika, I call it phase 2, but it's really the first phase of perestroika, from 1985 to 1988, involves a purge of Central Asian elites. So when Gorbachev came to power, other heads of Central Asia were also replaced, not just the head of Uzbekistan. And some people saw the writing on the wall. The Kyrgyz first secretary, for example, the first secretary being the head of the Communist Party, took early retirement in 1985, but first he tried to save himself by conducting his own purge of corrupt officials. And once he was out, because he couldn't save himself, Moscow orchestrated a larger scale purge of the administration there too. The same thing happened in Turkmenistan, where the head of the Communist Party left, although he left rather quietly. But he had to leave power. So there's this purge that was going on, orchestrated by Moscow. Gorbachev began to put a special focus on Central Asia when in his anti-corruption drive, because Central Asia was seen to be the home of corruption. In fact, Gorbachev openly attacked the Uzbeks and the Kyrgyz and the Kazakhs in an address to the 27th Party Congress early in 1986. Many in Central Asia saw this as an unfair attack. They felt like they were being scapegoated. This wasn't appreciated. Many locals and non-elites, masses, felt they were making the best of an already very corrupt system in doing what they were doing. Lots of money, you have to remember, was involved in the cotton scandal. It was probably a series of cotton scandals, but there was a big one that was the focus. The money had gone to help fellow Uzbeks who would have gotten the shorter end of the stick by following official procedures. They would have gotten much lower pay, a really subsistence sort of pay. And so they felt like they were just using the system the only way that was fair. In other words, what Moscow saw as corruption, Central Asians saw as fairness. The cuts that were taken in this whole corruption scandal increased social mobility. They provided goods and services that were promised by Moscow, but not actually provided by Moscow. And attacks by Moscow, by the center, were seen as a step back to colonialism and a step back to repression. To throw oil on the fire, leaders in Moscow sought to replace native elites with imports, mostly Slavs from other parts of the Soviet Union. And this is important because remember, historically, the way it always worked was the first secretary was a member of the titular nationality in each republic, and then the second secretary, the second up in the Communist Party, was a Slav, and usually Russian. And now Moscow was trying to put Slavs and Russians, especially from other parts of the Soviet Union, into Central Asian first secretary and other high-level positions. So not just first secretary. And in fact, I don't know how many first secretaries were actually transformed, but other high-level positions within the Communist Party. So even if the first secretary was still a titular nationality, they would flood the other parts of the party, higher echelons, with Russians. They were doing this, claiming that corruption was a consequence of the native culture, of the native religion. So it all sounded so colonial, going back to the Tsarist period. And this led to riots, in particular in Almaty, the capital of the Kazakh Republic, in 1986. But it also led to massive house cleansings by new titular elites. So the new Kazakh first secretary and the new Uzbek first secretary and the new Kyrgyz first secretary, ethnically respective to the republics, actually went about these huge house cleansings as well. The next thing that you see here is an anti-Islam campaign, and this is closely linked to this, because if culture was responsible for corruption, then Islam was the main culprit here. Now, under Gorbachev, generally there was a gradual revival of religion around the Soviet Union, but this was neither immediate nor uniform across Soviet societies. And in Central Asia, Moscow felt the Islamic culture resulted in much of the corruption, and so Gorbachev actually demanded an intensification of anti-religious propaganda and an anti-religion program to complement his anti-corruption and modernization drive. And he singled out Islam, as did the state-controlled press. And so Islam was attacked. Moscow, for example, declared an atheism month and sent people, Slavs, to the region where they worked in rural areas to press for atheism. Local elites even sometimes supported these efforts, many of these elites thinking it was in their best interest. There was a crackdown on the unofficial clergy, who had been tolerated locally for a long time. But all this was fairly short-lived, because soon, and already in 1987, Gorbachev was facing pressure by the Orthodox hierarchy in Russia to allow more religious freedom. And this spreads to other places, including Central Asia as well. So the next point here is that you had an increased Russification of the leadership, something that I just mentioned. This happened in two ways. One, the exchange of ideas. The idea was to internationalize Central Asia by bringing people, and by internationalize I mean internation, literally. So bringing people from different republics of the Soviet Union into Central Asia to run. So especially going from the center to the periphery. And they'd always done this in the early years. The idea was to prevent national elites from deciding to just leave with their republic. As you remember from the Stalin Constitution, in theory they could. They were also trying to create the Soviet man, at least under this elite umbrella. But as local fiefdoms seemed to arise during this corruption scandal, Moscow was even more determined to internationalize the lead cadre by sending Russians and Slavs to the peripheries in greater numbers. Moscow elites commented that Russians were really the glue to the system, and they grimaced at the perception that they were increasingly losing power to locals. So this amounted to a Russification, really a re-Russification. And there were clear differences in perception. In Almaty, the Almaty riots, for example, Kazakhs blamed these on the insensitivity of Moscow, but Moscow elites blamed them on precisely the localism and the nationalism that they sought to wipe out through their policy of elite internationalization. So very different perceptions in Central Asia of what was happening and in the official line that was going on. Remember that all these reforms by Soviet leaders were intended to strengthen the state. They believed in the Soviet state. They lived and breathed the Soviet state. And they admitted to complicated internation differences, but they felt in general this wouldn't doom it. And so they were fomenting the Soviet man still into the 1980s. So the second way the Soviet Union, based in Moscow, was trying to increase the Russification of Union leadership, was actually at the center, actually in Moscow. So not only was the cadre Russified, literally, but they also increasingly focused on the center, and Slavs now dominated the Politburo. Central Asians who had been present under Brezhnev, at least a couple, were now pushed out. And moreover, these weren't just Russians or Slavs who now presided over the lead party organizations in Moscow, including the Politburo, but they were Slavs with very little or no experience in the periphery. Their experience usually was only within one republic, like Ukraine or somewhere Belarus, Russia. So the region with the greatest population growth at the time, being Central Asia, the region with the greatest poverty at the time, being Central Asia, wasn't even represented at this time of immense change, of perestroika and glasnost. So those in the center felt they were being ignored or misunderstood. I'm sorry, those in the center were being accused of ignoring or misunderstanding the increasing pressure from the south or from the periphery. Those in the center thought, hey, this is just hooliganism. These are just some corrupt cadres. They believed that the USSR needed to remain a unified economic space, and so necessarily cultural rights and cadre policy would be affected because they didn't call it Russify, it was Sovietize the area. And all of this led to the reawakening here of local intellectual elites. The attacks on religion and other attacks on Central Asian nationalities, especially their leaders, their representatives, gradually led to the awakening of these local intellectuals. This might have never happened if it hadn't been for glasnost, and it was slow anyway. People waited for the waters to be tested in other Soviet states before they got involved in this in Central Asia. By the mid-1980s, there were organizations that were active, but they were quite elitist. They were predominantly secular, issue-specific, semi-nationalistic, really anti-colonial. In 1988, perestroika faced possible derailment as conservatives attacked the socialist credentials of reformers and the negative effects of perestroika on the communist system in general, as I mentioned before, but Gorbachev ultimately won the support of the Politburo, and he pushed perestroika further. So now, this was the point when Gorbachev saw that economic reforms wouldn't work unless there was some sort of ideological change. You couldn't have successful perestroika without democratization. In other words, the attack by conservatives showed Gorbachev and his supporters that he needed more popular support. And this was when we have the glasnost, which I mentioned before. And now we've got glasnost in Central Asia by the late 1980s, around 1988. And this is the point when, as I mentioned before, earlier reforms were hastened. They sought to end the communist monopoly on decision-making and open the floor to previously excluded elements of society who were craving more input already. It's also involved more religious freedom. Gorbachev promised more religious freedom, and he brought this freedom first to the Orthodox Church in Moscow, where he met with the head of the Orthodox Church for the first time since Stalin had in World War II by a Soviet leader. And this was really an effort to regain social trust and reward believers for their support, and also give them a stake in glasnost and perestroika. He sought to reconcile Leninist principles with, quote, the realities of the present. He also eased administrative pressures on religious institutions. There was less harassment of the clergy. He allowed religious organizations more freedom of action, for example, to volunteer at hospitals, help run orphanages, or at least volunteer at orphanages. But he kept the church and state separate throughout this period. Now, as he prepared a law on religious freedom, it's interesting to note, and this took 2 years, he asked most religious organizations for their input on this, and this included a Muslim board for the European part of the USSR and Siberia. But notably, he did not ask the Muslim board of Central Asia, the Muslim board being the official Central Asian branch of Islam. So what you saw was religious freedom growing in much of the Soviet Union, but some leaders in Central Asia still condemning religion and being supported by Moscow for doing this. This was really until the masses, whom Gorbachev was trying to get on board, fought back, and they protested in late 1988, demanding religious freedom. A series of tainted clergy was forced to resign. Some old mosques were reopened, to the degree that you had actually twice as many in 1990 as you had in 1985. And religious schools were also allowed to open. Religious associations were more easily registered. So all these things began to happen in around 1989, 1990. And all these dynamics helped lead to a greater focus on nation and ethnicity, and they led to ethnic riots, a rise in nationalism around the region, but also around the Soviet Union, all over the place. So in Georgia and in Moldova, um, and all over the place. But in Central Asia, you saw this as well, and we'll talk about this in the next class. Many of the local movements that we'll actually talk about in the next set of lectures represented nationalist agendas, and these include the major sort of liberal movements. They were liberal, but they were also quite nationalist. So that's it for today. So your brief glimpse into perestroika in Central Asia, and we'll take that up again in the next set of lectures.